Before I begin, I just want to remind you that I'm so excited about what we have planned for Holy Week. I hope that you will begin to prepare your hearts and minds for that. We hope that you'll start to think about how you can join us in prayer and fasting, find something to remove from your life that makes room for time with Him, whether that's food or social media or television or whatever it is that God speaks to you about. We hope that you'll use that time to really focus on what God can do as we celebrate Palm Sunday and we move towards Good Friday. And then, of course, into Easter. We hope that you'll join us as we think about ways to set aside special time to build that relationship with Jesus. Last week, we stood on a grassy hillside on the far side of the Sea of Galilee, and Matt walked us through how Jesus took 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish, the meager lunch of a boy, and he fed 5,000 men, not counting the women and children. And we saw Jesus as the bread of life. And in our Back to Sunday School series, we've been following the life of Jesus from his birth at Christmas all the way through to Easter, and looking at it in chronological order so you can see the kind of unfolding events of Jesus' ministry here on earth and what that 3.5 years looked like that he was here in the flesh. That ministry is really what we've been focusing on. And so as Jesus stood on that hill at the side of the Sea of Galilee, we watched the feeding of the 5,000, right? He met the physical hunger of the body and pointed toward the deeper hunger of the soul. But as we move forward in his ministry, you're going to find a pattern. Jesus goes a lot of places, causes a disruption, gets people excited and scared at the same time, and creates a disturbance, only for people to discover the same thing again. Who is this guy? And that's a question often asked. Who is this man? By those who experience, whether it was the woman at the well, whether it was the disciples in the boat, whether it was last week when we saw the feeding of the 5,000 with his own disciples, Philip and others. What we see in John 6 was that he provided bread, but in John 9, he's going to provide sight. One sustains life, the other defines it. One fills the stomach, the other fills the eyes with the glory of God. Today we're back in Jerusalem again, and it is the Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus is walking near the temple, likely near one of its massive gates, possibly even the beautiful gate that we hear referred to when John and Peter were walking by and healed the lame man. But here Jesus is with the disciples, most likely, standing by one of the gates at the temple. It likely could have been the Nicanor gate. It stood nearly 75 feet tall. It was made of polished Corinthian bronze, and it shimmered in the sun. You could see the gates of the temple from far away because of the shining light off of the bronze. Pilgrims would ascend the southern steps, and as they would ascend those steps, they would sing the Psalms of the Ascent. Incense filled the air, being burned for their love for God. Priests blew the trumpets at the hour of prayer so people knew when it was time to pray. The temple courts reflected brilliant light. And so the stage is set for this beautiful situation where the temple is ready, the Feast of Tabernacles is on. It is the Sabbath, just so you know. And all right there, right at the threshold of glory, because the temple is where the presence of God lived, sat a man who had never seen any of it. He heard the songs, but he never saw the singers. He smelled the incense, but he never saw the smoke. He felt the warmth of the sun, but he'd never seen its light. He lived inches from worship, but miles from being welcomed. For a man born blind, the temple was not an invitation, it was a limitation. He could not work, he could not participate in society, so he sat at the gate where the religious leaders passed by. See, the law commended almsgiving, called tzedakah. The most righteous place to give was near the temple because then everyone would see you giving. So he became part of the scenery. He was the man at the gate, the beggar, the blind man. He didn't even have a name. He was just that guy by the gates. He sat there blind every single day of his life from the time he was old enough to go and beg, but he was blind from birth. And every single day he sat at that gate waiting for the religious leaders to come by and drop coins, not necessarily out of compassion, but to feel righteous. People would donate to him to make themselves feel better and to make sure others saw them donating at the temple. Then John tells us in John chapter 9 and verse 1, as Jesus went along, he saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? I want you to notice something here. Before the man ever saw Jesus, Jesus saw him. Like many of the stories we've shared, the Samaritan woman and others, Jesus saw the need long before the need saw him. And in this case was no different. This blind man not only couldn't physically see him, but had no idea what was about to happen with Jesus. He had never seen color. He'd never seen his own mother's face. He'd never seen a sunrise. He'd never even seen himself or his reflection. He didn't know what he looked like. His identity was shaped by what others said about him, and they were not kind things. See, the theology of the street was simple. If you suffered, if something was wrong with you, you must have sinned, or your family sinned. And so he was blind because someone in his family sinned, or he sinned, and that's what caused him to be in this condition. So he sat there, a living monument to assumed guilt. Some of you know that feeling. You live under a label, to believe a narrative someone else wrote for you, to sit outside what looks like a blessing, convinced you don't belong. Some of you come to church on Sunday morning convinced you aren't good enough, valued enough, loved enough to be here, and you feel a bit like a fraud. But Jesus is about to flip the script. We're going to move from blame to purpose. When the floor falls out from under us, our first instinct is to hunt for a culprit, right? We want to know, we ransack our history and think to ourselves, why behind the what? Why is this happening? We sift through our childhood, our mistakes, our deepest regrets, convinced that our current darkness is a receipt for a past sin. There must be some reason why I'm going through this. We treat our suffering like a courtroom, and in our minds, we're always the ones sitting in the defendant's chair, waiting for a sentence we think we deserve, trying to figure out what's so wrong with us. Why am I so broken? Why am I so unloved? Why am I so uncared for that these bad things would happen to me? And the disciples did exactly this. They didn't see a human being. They saw a theological puzzle. They looked at a man immediately who had spent his entire life in the shadows and asked the question that was as cold as the morgue: who sinned? They wanted a cause. They wanted to categorize his pain so they could feel safe in their own health. Because if blindness or any other ailment came as the result of sin, then they were safe and they would be healthy because they weren't sinning. So they wanted to categorize his pain to feel safe. But Jesus walks into the courtroom and tears up the indictment. He refuses to participate in the blame game because the blame is a dead end. It offers a reason but never a rescue. And Jesus shifts the perspective from the cause to the intention. He teaches us that our struggles are not always a gotcha. God is not got a giant magnifying glass trying to burn us like little ants. It's not a divine punishment. They are the stage where the miraculous begins. He invites us to stop looking for someone to blame and start looking for a God who's already rolling up his sleeves and ready to get to work. We pick up in John chapter 9 and verse 3, it says, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. Now this controverted all the teachings that the disciples had been given as children and adults. And then Jesus says, "But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." Now, first of all, the disciples are probably thinking, what did he just say? Neither this man nor his parents sinned. First of all, you've just controverted their teachings. Everything they've known as a child and everything they've learned throughout their time at the temple was, if he was blind, there must be some sin. And Jesus declares a purpose. And then he says, this happened so that my Father's glory could be on display. And also, by the way, I'm the light of the world. So whether he can see or not, I provide the light for him. See, Jesus declares a purpose, and they want to look backward at the dirt. Jesus looks for the glory. They want to see what's wrong with him. Notice what he does not do. Jesus does not offer a sterile theological lecture. He doesn't lecture them on the underpinnings of the theological ideas here. He doesn't pull out a chart of divine mechanics or ask for the scrolls to be brought from the synagogue to explain away the man's years of isolation, begging, and brokenness. He doesn't give a why. He gives his presence. The greatest answer to human suffering in the Bible is not an explanation, it's his incarnation. The fact that he was willing to leave heaven and come to be in the dirt with us. God does not shout encouragement from the safety of the clouds. He steps down into the dust. He trades the throne of heaven for the mud and the spit of a miracle. He proves that he's not a God who's above our mess, but a God who's willing to get in it. When Jesus says, I'm the light of the world, it's a thunderclap of hope. See, because a lot of these folks have been living in darkness. For 700 years, they had not heard from God since the last prophets. And think of the context. During the Feast of the Tabernacles, massive lampposts would be lit around the entire temple. They symbolized the pillar of fire that God provided for them as they moved out of the wilderness. So in the middle of that celebration, Jesus stands next to a man who's never seen a sunset and says, the fire that led the nation is now standing in the dirt next to the beggar. You see, the fire that led them through the nation, that is God in the Trinity. And so that fire that he's talking about, that light that led the Israelites through the wilderness back in the Old Testament, he's saying, I am that light. And if you're sitting in a season of darkness right now, your pain is not evidence of God's absence. It is a candidate for his glory. We scream, why did this happen? While Jesus asks, what will my Father display through this? He does not always flip a switch to remove the darkness. Often he does something much more intimate. He enters it. He doesn't just point to the light, he becomes the light, illuminating the very path that he walks right beside you. He takes the because of that has haunted your mind. Because of this, I have that. Because of this, I have that. And he says, so that. You have this so that. That moves us from the mud to a miracle. We often want a miracle that's clean. I know I'm not alone in that. We want it instantaneous. We want it dignified. We want God to speak a word from a distance and sprinkle a little magic dust on us and get our mess all cleaned up. But grace rarely works in a vacuum. Most of the time, the miracle begins exactly where the pain did, in the dirt. Jesus doesn't offer a prayer. He offers us a process. He enters the very element of our shame and our limitation to show that he isn't afraid of our muddy parts. If you think you're hiding your muddy parts from him, you are wrong. He takes the common, the broken, the overlooked, and he begins to knead them into something new. Before the man ever sees the light, he has to feel the weight of the Creator's touch in the darkness. Sometimes before we can get to that light, we have to sit in the darkness and wait for the Creator. In John chapter 9 and verse 6, it says, after saying this, Jesus spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on a man's eyes. Gross. Jesus sees the blind man sitting there. He's been blind since birth. He has this theological conversation with the disciples to say, hey, not so fast. Sometimes God's just using this for his glory. And then he kneels down and spits on the ground and makes mud. And then he puts it on the man's eyes, like his life is not rough enough. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. I love how it just says that like it's, and then he just went down, he washed, and he would see, right? Like it's just no big deal, right? Jesus bends down. He makes mud. He presses it into the man's blind eyes. You have to imagine the disciples are thinking, what is going on here? They saw Jesus, right? In the boat, peace be still, wind, knock it off, right? They saw him feed the 5,000. They've seen him heal others. They've seen him remove the demon from a man. They've seen him, and they've seen him, they've seen him. And now he's bending down and spitting on the ground and putting mud in this man's eyes. And they're probably thinking, because if I would be thinking is, can't you just say, like, you're not blind anymore? Like, what's with the mud, right? Like, just, hey, see, done. That's what he said to the waves, behave. That's what he told them, right? And they just behaved. Like, so why can't he just say, see, and the man can see? He spits on the ground, he puts the mud in the man's eyes, and he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. So why mud? Here's what I think. Genesis 2 tells us that God formed man from the dust of the ground. In the garden, life began when the breath of God met the soil. And here in John 9, the Creator kneels in the dust again. It's not a random act, it's a recreation. The Word who was there in the beginning, because in the beginning was the Word was God, it's Jesus, right? He was there, he is the Creator, now reaches into the debris of this broken life to reshape this man who's been fractured since birth. Jesus is not just restoring the man's sight, he's reclaiming the original intent of creation, making this man whole from the dust to the ground. Then he sends the man to the pool of Siloam. What he's really saying, by the way, is, just in case you're wondering, I'm God. This wasn't just any pool, by the way, when he sent him to Siloam, because if it were not important that you know this pool, it would have just been he sent him to the water. There's lots of times when they just refer to it as the water. But it was very intentional that he sent him to the pool of Siloam. Siloam was fed by Hezekiah's tunnel, which in the Old Testament was a lifeline cut through rock that allowed these Israelites to escape during one of the many times they had been enslaved during a time of siege. So they could get away from the enemy. They went through this passage. So the people of Israel, this was salvation water. This pool of Siloam was deliverance. And during the Feast of Tabernacles, which was happening at the time, the priest would draw water from that pool in a golden pitcher to symbolize the outpouring of the messianic hope. Now here's the irony, of course. Jesus is sending him to the pool of Siloam, which they are recognizing is the promise of the Messiah, who, by the way, is standing right there, but many don't believe. And the name itself is a prophecy. Siloam means sent. The one who was sent from the Father now sends the blind man to a pool called Sent. It's a divine handoff. But notice the tension in the middle of the miracle. The healing doesn't happen instantly. The man is left in a state of profound vulnerability. Now, let's paint the picture, okay? He's been sitting by the gate his entire life, as long as he's been old enough to beg. Every day people call him the beggar, the blind man, whatever. He now has Jesus spit in some dirt, take the mud, put it in his eyes, and say, go wash. The man cannot see still. Go wash in the pool of Siloam. Doesn't give him directions. It's not like the man's like, oh, the pool of Siloam, I know where that is. He cannot see. The man is left in a state of profound vulnerability. During the Feast of Tabernacles, it would have been very crowded on the streets. There would have been tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people there at the temple going back and forth. He has mud smeared across his face. He still cannot see, and now he has to navigate the crowded, narrow streets of Jerusalem, stumbling toward a destination he's never seen, guided only by the voice of a man he's never met. Seems simple enough, especially for a guy who could have just said, poof, and made it better. See, faith is often muddy before it's clear. I want to be clear about the fact that you are not always going to understand, frankly, many times you're not going to understand why I have mud in my eyes when Jesus could just make it all go away. Some of you are currently in that walking to the pool phase. You've encountered Jesus, you've felt his touch, but your vision hasn't cleared yet. You feel messy. You feel exposed. You feel more confused now than you did before you started, but you must understand that obedience precedes clarity. The miracle isn't found in the sitting. It's found in the movement. God often hides the breakthrough behind a step of blind obedience. He doesn't give us the map. Everyone else hears that, right? They want to talk about Jonah. We already covered that. I don't know. So make sure I wasn't hearing things. God often hides these breakthroughs behind a step of blind obedience. He doesn't give us the map. He gives us the next step. If you want the sight, you have to keep walking with the mud. So this man, we don't know exactly how far the Pool of Siloam was, but it was not like right next door. It was a walk for him through a crowded street with the mud in his eyes, knowing that everyone was looking at him like he was crazy. And he had to keep walking, but the Bible says he went and he washed and he could see. And that moves us from beggar to witness. The most disruptive thing you can do in a world comfortable with your brokenness is get well. I'm going to say that again. The most disruptive thing you can do in a world comfortable with your brokenness is get well. For years, the man was a landmark of misery, a fixture of the city gates that people walked past without a second thought. He was invisible until he became inconvenient. Now that he stands tall, his very existence demands an explanation. Let me let you a little secret. There are some people in your life, before today or today still, who kind of like you in your broken state. They're not that fond of better you. They would rather believe their eyes are playing tricks on them than believe that God has played a hand in your story. And it creates a crisis for those who prefer the old you. But as the crowd debates his identity, the man refuses to let him push back into the shadows. He stands in the center of the chaos and claims the miracle as his own. We pick up in verse 8 in John 9. It says, his neighbors, because remember, he just got his eyesight, and then poof, he's gone. So it sounds like he goes home. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging ask, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes opened, they asked. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see. Where is this man, they asked. I don't know, he said. Now remember, Jesus is there, he can't see. Mud in his eyes, he can't see. He goes to the Pool of Siloam, Jesus is over here. Guess who he's never seen after he got his eyesight? Jesus. He has no idea what he looks like. So they're like, where's Jesus at now? I don't know. I couldn't see 10 minutes ago, remember? So the neighbors begin to argue. They try to explain away the supernatural with the logical, which your friends will try to do to you. Isn't this the man? No, it just looks like him. But he insists, I am the man. Hey, I'm not denying this. I'm not trying to hide this. For decades, he'd been defined by his condition. He was the blind man. He was the beggar. He was a category, not a person. But the moment the scales fell off, the labels fell with him. And now all of a sudden, he's no longer the beggar or the blind man. Now he reclaims his identity. He doesn't hide his past to make his present look better. He used it to make God look bigger. You're not hiding your past from anybody, and nobody cares. If there's anybody here who doesn't have a past, please raise your hand. The man is not trying to pretend like, oh, no, I wasn't that blind guy. No, I've been able to see my whole life. He was like, yeah, that was me. Yep, total blind man. But Jesus set me down, and now I can see. See, grace doesn't erase your history. It restores your voice, and frankly, your history is what God's going to use to change other people's lives. And when Jesus changes your life, it will confuse people who only knew you in your darkness. They will try to tell you that you're just going through a phase, or it won't last. They'll try to reconcile the person you were with the person you're becoming, and they will fail. And sometimes you'll have to cut them loose. You don't need a degree in divinity to be a witness. You don't have to understand all of the doctrines and memorize the scriptures to have a witness. You don't need polished theology or a 5-point sermon. You just need your story. Just tell your story. Notice that when they ask him how, he doesn't give them a lecture on the chemical properties of saliva or the physics of light. He gives them the facts of his encounter. I went, I washed, and then I could see. That's it. I went, I washed, and then I could see. Your testimony is the one thing the world cannot argue with. They can debate your doctrine, they can mock your faith, they can question your church, but they cannot unsee the light in your eyes. If you have been to the pool, you are no longer a beggar for the world's approval. You are a witness to the Father's power. And that brings us from fear to faith. When God does something new, those who are comfortable with the old will often try to legislate it out of existence. And there's nobody in the Bible who does that better than the Pharisees. They are always around, always trying to get in Jesus' business, always trying to tear him down. So we think that if we can categorize a miracle, that we can control it, especially if we don't want to reconcile with our own problems. We see others change, and we think to ourselves, it won't last. They won't really mean it. That's okay. God doesn't really love them any more than he loves me. But if faith isn't found in the safety of the status quo, it's found in the courage to stand by what you've experienced. Don't hide from what God has delivered you from. Use it as a testimony for what God will do for others. Even when the world demands that you deny it and wants you to feel bad about what happened. The religious leaders weren't looking for a celebration. They weren't there to celebrate that the man was no longer blind. They were looking for a violation. They didn't see a man who could finally look his mother in the eye. They saw a breach of protocol. They preferred the blind man who followed the rules over a healed man who broke tradition. And in John 9:13, it says they brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. This man has had a long day. And now he's going to stand for the Pharisees on trial, basically. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He, being Jesus, put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, well, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. So you got the folks who are saying, well, it's the Sabbath. If he were really from God, he would never have done this on the Sabbath, because we've got rules, you know. We got rules. Then there were those who were like, well, yeah, but if he's a sinner, how could he have made the man see again? Because that doesn't make any sense. Sinners cannot have that kind of authority from God. And so that's the problem. The problem was the Sabbath, right? So Jesus did this on the Sabbath. The Pharisees had constructed 39 categories of forbidden work to protect the holiness of the day. To them, mixing spit and dirt wasn't a miracle. Healing wasn't mercy. It was labor. They could parse the mud. They could debate the saliva. They could analyze the mechanics of the spit. But they could not celebrate his sight. The one thing they were unwilling to do is say, you could not see and now you can. This is amazing. The tragedy of the Pharisees is not that they love the law. It's that they love the system more than the Savior. They were so busy guarding the gates of heaven, they didn't see that the king had already walked in. Some of us are addicted to rules. Some of us are so litigious in our faith that we find ourselves sitting on the defense seat again every single day instead of saying, I couldn't see, and then Jesus, and now I can see. In John 9:22, we see the same thing with his parents. We don't know how old this man is, but we know he's of age because they're about to tell us he is. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, he's of age, ask him. Cowards. The Pharisee said to his parents, you tell us the truth. How did this happen? His parents knew he was blind. He was born that way. They knew every day he went down to beg. And he was of age, which means he was probably old enough, but not really that old. And they knew if they claimed that Jesus had done this, they had believed the miracle of the Messiah, they themselves would be tossed out of the synagogue and not allowed into the temple. And so they said, he's old enough, you ask him. I mean, even then, they couldn't see the miracle that had occurred. To be expelled from the synagogue was social death. It meant economic ruin, family shame, and total isolation. And even the man's own parents, the ones who'd held him in the darkness for years, chose their membership over their son. Fear silences courage. It made us trade our testimony for comfort. But this man, this former beggar, he had nothing to lose. He stands firm. In chapter 9, verse 24, A second time, they summoned the man who'd been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth. So first of all, they started by saying, hey, you're a liar, and we know that, so let's stop the lying. We know this man's a sinner. Well, what are you asking me for then? He replied, whether he is a sinner or not. So I don't know. I can't tell you what I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, and now I see. When people try to remind you of your past, when people try to drag you into the mud, when people try to question your faith, all you have to say is, I was blind and now I see. I don't know anything else. I can't explain millennialism or transubstantiation or all the other theological doctrines. I don't know who Arminian is or Calvin is, but I know I was blind and now I can see, and that's all that matters. He refuses to play their game. He doesn't try to out-argue their theology or match the degrees. He simply stands on the ground of his own transformation. He doesn't argue, he testifies. When Satan comes at you with something, I don't care what it is, just say to him, I don't know what to tell you. I was blind and now I can see. I was a sinner and now I'm not. I was an alcoholic and now I'm not. I was a abuser and now I'm not. I was a sinner. I was a liar. I was a cheat. I was a thief. I don't care what it is, but now I'm not. The world will try to pull you into debate about things you don't fully understand just to try to discredit your faith, to try to minimize who you are and the salvation that God's provided you. They will ask you to explain the Trinity and the origin of evil or the mechanics of grace. But the most explosive thing you can offer a skeptical world is the life that's been fully affected by Jesus. People can argue with logic, they can mock your politics, they can ignore your church, but they cannot argue with your change. I was and now. When you move from the I think to the I know, you move from a religion of fear to faith that's unshakable. The mud is gone, the scales have fallen. The only truth that matters at this point is I was in the dark and now I'm in the light. That brings us from sight to worship. See, there's a profound difference between being healed and being whole. Many people want the fix, the restored health, the amended relationship, the financial breakthrough, but they walk away without ever knowing the healer. And I'll tell you that most times I've heard this message preached in the past, this is where the story ends. We don't even pay attention to this last piece, which is so important. But they walk away without ever knowing the healer. You see, the man walked away, went to the pool of Siloam, got his eyesight back, and went home. Then he gets dragged in front of the Pharisees a couple of times and basically gets tossed out. He's tossed out of the synagogue, even though he can see now. He's no longer a beggar or blind. He's now not allowed in because he believes that Jesus is the Messiah. He's also tossed out by his parents because they don't want to get kicked out of the synagogue themselves, so they toss him out. And so here he is in isolation now. He's been relieved of his blindness, but added to him all these other pieces. The tragedy of a miracle is when we fall in love with the gift, but we ignore the giver. You see, in this final scene, the man's an outcast. He's been disowned by his parents. He's been excommunicated by the church. He's technically seeing, but he's totally alone. But Jesus, who began this journey by stepping into the man's darkness in the first place, now steps into his isolation. He doesn't just heal the man to leave him. He sought him out to claim him. We find that in verse 35. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, you hear that? He came looking for the man. He knew what had happened to him, and he said, I will go find him. He said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And in all honesty, he'd never known who Jesus is. He didn't even see the man when he put the mud in his eyes. Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, so the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Notice the beautiful, accelerated progress of his faith. I mean, this man went from that morning going to the gates to beg like he always did, hoping for a few coins. He started with a name. He first calls him the man called Jesus. Then as his understanding deepens, he calls him the prophet. And under the heat of persecution, he realizes he is from God. But here, standing face to face with the light of the world, looking him in the eye, knowing that he came finding him, he finally says, Lord, I believe. You see, physical sight came instantly, but his spiritual sight took some time. The miracle of the eyes wasn't the invitation. The miracle of the heart was really what Jesus wanted to do. We often wonder why God doesn't give us all the answers at once. Number one, I don't think we can handle them. But I also think it's because he isn't just trying to fill our heads. He's trying to lead our feet. Faith is a walk, it's not a leap. Jesus concludes with a warning that should rattle every one of us. The greatest blindness is not a lack of information, it's a resistance to revelation of who he is. Some of us are still in denial. Who is this man? We keep seeing that being said over and over again. But knowledge without humility is just darkness with a bigger vocabulary. You see, the Pharisees had education, scrolls. They were the most educated men in the area. They had history, they had vocabulary, but again, knowledge without humility is just darkness with a big vocabulary. I can stand up here and spout out all the things I know about the Bible, all the things I've learned. I took entire semesters on Old Testament, New Testament, exegesis, and all these things, and I can spout out all kinds of big, fancy words. But the reality is, if I don't have a relationship with the light of the world, none of that matters. They were blind. The Pharisees and his parents were blind because they were convinced they already saw everything clearly. They thought they knew it. They understood it. They were so right that they were completely wrong. The beggar, however, had the one thing the Pharisees lacked, the honesty to admit he had needs. The Pharisees, I don't need anything. I'm the Pharisee. He knew he was blind, so he was ready for the light. The Pharisees insisted they could see, so they were left in the dark. That's what Jesus says, I will make those who see blind. The Pharisees thought they could see, but the reality was they were blinder than anyone. At the end of the story, the beggar who had nothing has everything because he has Jesus. The men who had everything ended up with nothing because they only had themselves, and only the person who admits they're in the dark can ever truly walk in the light. The question isn't whether Jesus is the light. The question is, are you willing to admit that you need him? Some of you are still sitting at the gate. But every one of you in this room is somewhere in this story today, I promise you. Some of you are still sitting at the gate paralyzed by the why me? Why, God? What have I done so wrong? Why don't I belong? Why don't I matter? Why did you let me go through this? Why? That has no answer. Just like the disciples. Why is this man blind? Is he a sinner? Some of you are walking to the pool with mud in your eyes. You feel the mess on your face. You're wondering if the healing will come. You have no idea where the pool is. You're just hoping at some point you'll get pointed in the right direction, and eventually you'll be able to see. And some of you are like the Pharisees, defending systems and structures because you're terrified of what happens if you lose control. The question is not, do you know about him? The Pharisees knew about him, and they missed him. He was standing right in front of them. The question is, do you believe? Salvation does not begin with a promotion. It begins with an admission. Jesus, I believe. It starts with the brutal, beautiful honesty of 3 words. I was blind. That's it. No resume, no theological defense, no mask, just total unconditional surrender. The light of the world is not a flickering candle. It's a rising sun, and it's shining in this room right now. And you have 2 choices. You can close your eyes tight to protect your pride and your labels, or you can open them and finally be healed. For this man, the gift of daylight was not about seeing trees or the sky. It was about finally seeing the face of Jesus. May we be a people who admit our blindness quickly. May we walk toward the pool of Siloam obediently, even when the path is messy and hard. May we tell our story boldly to a world that wants to silence us. And may we fall at his feet joyfully, because when the light walks into the room, darkness doesn't just lose, it disappears. Would you stand with me for just a moment? It was amazing to me how the word is so committed to application today. You know, you read these stories, it's been over 2,000 years, and yet we find ourselves sitting right there at the gate. We find ourselves wrestling with the same questions. We find ourselves looking at the gospel the same way that it was looked at then, when it was happening. But I'm so happy for that. Because today I think there are people in this room who are sitting at the gate. And they're wondering why. They don't understand the situation they're in, and they're just confused. But there are also people who have mud in their eyes, who are walking towards the pool. They're trusting God, but they're not real sure, and they're kind of embarrassed, or they're not sure about their destination, or they're worried about what others think, or they're not sure if God can actually come through, and they're just wandering until they find the water. And then there are those who are standing back saying, it's not possible. God can't do that. I'm too far gone. I'm too sinful. I'm too this. I'm too that. God doesn't love. God doesn't care. There are rules to this, and I don't fit in that pattern. There's so many of you coming here on Sunday mornings who feel totally unworthy. And God is just sitting there finding you before you're finding him. And all he's asking you to do is get up and walk to the pool. Father God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your message. We thank you for the inspired word and what it means to us. And God, I can't help but believe that you put this message on our hearts and delivered it in a way because you know there are folks here who need to hear that if they're standing by the gate, that you are ready to show your glory. And if they're walking toward the pool, that you're with them every step of the way. And if they're standing on the sidelines saying that can't be possible, that you would help them see that you care for them even when they didn't care for you. And God, I hope their hearts are stirred, their minds are shifted, and that they find their face bowed towards a God and a Creator who cares. For it's in your name we pray. Amen. Prayer team is here. The altars are open. If you need to come and deal with the why, do it now. If you're walking towards the pool and things are muddy, you're going through things, ask God for clarity. And if you're standing on the sidelines thinking it can't be me, just take that step out and come here and say, God, I believe.